Alright, so we have three more movies to talk about. All three new releases from this weekend. Two of which are really good, and one that's an absolute disaster, so we'll put the disaster kind of in between to balance things out, I think. So, let's start with the obvious big one, which is Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. And what's really fun about this is that obviously a lot of people, they're while most people seem to really love the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, you also have that group of people that thinks they're really overrated and they get like too much leeway. Like they're like any flaws they might have, people go a bit easy on because whether it be the world being established or already or whatever. But the thing that really excites me and really excited me about this one was and a few other upcoming ones we have is that yeah, there is something about the familiarity of going into this world that you already know really well. So, like, when they mention stuff like, oh, people disappeared for 5 years and stuff like that, there's that familiarity that, like, helps you come into the story kind of immediately before. Because all movies always have to kind of get their information out before they really get going. And there's a part of that, even in the origin stories, and is now that we're in this phase, that it's like we're still going in like we're already in it when we get there, even if it's a character we don't know. And that's the thing is that while that familiarity is there, there was also the mystery to me of this character in general. I had no idea who this character was, and that's kind of got an exciting factor going into it, even if otherwise it's a world that has already been established and you already know. So that's the kind of excitement I look forward to. That was kind of it felt similar to the excitement that I had going into Black Panther. I was obviously the excitement I had going into Black Panther was kind of unmatched still, but this did still feel similar of that. I don't really know too much about this character, and with Black Panther we'd had an introduction in Civil War already, but here I knew nothing about this character. The only thing I knew obviously was that the Ten Rings has been established at least a couple of times by this point, and it felt like there was a whole lot of like you want to talk about the build up between Thanos' first appearance at the end of the Avengers and then when we got to Endgame, but it's like the Ten Rings is something that's kind of always been here and always kind of lurking. It's like it feels like this is what like the real big build up has been or close to it. Um, we got that stuff with Jonathan Majors coming up as well, so it'll be curious to see how they handle these really big threats coming into it now. But yeah, so starting off with the somewhat of a backstory. What's really great about this is I know a lot of people are sick of origin stories, and that's definitely something I get. Like I can probably agree to an extent. But the way this movie handles that specifically, how it handles like flashbacks, how they're not like really comparable or anything, but Batman Begins kind of came to mind in the way they did it. Like we're getting a current story, but then whenever it's relevant, we get flashbacks of what's going on and where everything came from. Um, and that's more or less the style that it feels like it's in, and we get that like throughout the movie. Like it's still when we're headed to the third act, we're still getting flashbacks that kind of really build up Shang-Chi's character and where he came from and what his relationship with his father is and all that other stuff and how he got to this point, and knows how to fight the way that he does. But before that, we go way back and follow the very start of this story, which is his father, who is brilliantly cast with Tony Long, who we know obviously from like Wong Kar-wai movies mainly, but Infernal Affairs and stuff like that. Basically, any movie that was huge in Hong Kong likely had Tony Long. And the thing here is, as we follow him through time, we get to this point where he ends up meeting his love, ultimately Shang-Chi's mother, and the way this scene plays out, and it's a scene that could be out of something like Crouching Tiger or Once Upon a Time in China or whatever, um, House of Flying Daggers, something like that. And despite the fact that apparently a lot of the influence came from Jackie Chan, was what I heard going in. And while that's here later, we'll get to that scene. But This first fight scene between the two of them, when he meets, you know, Shang-Chi's future mother, um, it's it sort of had this vibe of the falling in love fight, or like kind of like the one in The Mask of Zorro between Antonio Banderas and Catherine Zeta-Jones, where it's like establishing the characters and their relationship through a fight scene. And so that immediately you got the sense that they were really taking a different storytelling approach here as far as going. I mean, there's still, you know, exposition throughout it, and there's still narration going on. But I think this one falls much more into the sort of visuals category, like the opening of Black Panther, where it's like usually it would just be like an establishing shot, or maybe even a black screen, and it's just a narrator talking to us. And it's like, well, we still get the narrator. We get these amazing visuals that are telling the story with it, and it feels much more fresh and pulls you in much more than just feeling like some regular generic movie that has narration that just tells you what's happening and what the history is. You actually kind of get to see it play out in really creative ways. So I'm always down for that. And then we jump ahead, and Shang-Chi's now an adult, and going by Sean, because everything's hidden. But the thing here is, we establish him so well. Similarly, the actor that's playing him, is really great here and has so much. Like, he's just bursting with personality. That's usually another thing that's kind of going on when you have stories like this. Is sometimes the lead can be a bit bland or something like that. Like, or it's like it's all about what's happening around the lead, and they're just kind of there, kind of following the path. And he's just bursting with personality immediately before we really see what he's capable of. Just when he's being a normal person, like a normal human being. And he's got his friend in Aquafina, who the chemistry with Aquafina is so good that it's kind of a running joke that they're not a couple, even though they really look like one. Like, I was convinced that they were a couple until we got the first moment of, oh no, we're just friends. And while usually that would be, like, you know, lame and predictable, like I said, the fact that the chemistry was so convincing, I just kind of assumed that they were, really says something. And the fact that they don't really take, like, the predictable route with that, like, it's like, I mean, if it's there, it's like really brief and not even that important, like what their relationship is. Just the fact that they're kind of inseparable is the point, which is really great. And what's really interesting about this is, you would think, talking about Marvel, and sometimes it's the way it struggles to balance comedy with everything else, and how, like, everything has to be punctuated with a joke. And while much of it can be funny, much of it can also be really forced. So I was a little concerned about the fact that our comedy relief character is Aquafina, because, you know, when Aquafina's on a set, there's somebody behind the camera going, be as over the top as possible, do the Aquafina thing. Do what you were doing in Crazy Rich Asians and every other movie afterwards. Apart from The Farewell, maybe. But, there's they actually find a really good balance. Like, I don't feel like this one had as much. I don't know if it's you could say it had as much humor, but it felt a lot more balanced and, like, better placed. And like, even to the point where, when we get our first big fight scene in present day on the bus, it's sort of like a nobody-esque scene. We're already getting movies that are nobody-esque in the year. We're still in the year nobody came out. But there's another fight on a bus, and there's a guy there that's live streaming for comedic purposes. And I feel like in another movie that would be, like, bombarding us with the comedy angle, this live stream guy would have been annoying. But not only does the humor not try to overshadow the scene, but I think it's incapable of overshadowing the scene because the action is so good, which is a really great sort of leveling out to have. And so you get this really great action scene with, as we were like, it was. I love that it makes news now when action scenes are competently done, because there's so many that are such shit and have so much cutting and you can't tell what's going on even during the day, because the editing is just so heavy, and they're trying so hard to make you not see stunt doubles. But to my understanding, Cinderella was doing a lot of this, so they were able to do it in like really big shots where you can actually see everything. And it's I don't want to quite compare it to the Raid. It's not that good, but the idea of like being in this enclosed space somewhat reminded me of the car chase in the Raid 2 a little bit, just a tiny bit. Um, and then while it's something that's moving and causing destruction all around, but the fight going on in the inside is what took me there. But yeah, and what's great about this also is that because we cut ahead, we just saw Shang-Chi as a child, and then we just cut to him in present day. We didn't see like a lot of training sequences or anything like that. So yet we see him like working out when he wakes up, but that's about it. So even still, when he's on the bus and we realize that a fight is about to break out, because we haven't seen much yet, it's almost like we're under the impression that he's going to be out of his element or something. And so when he just starts fighting, like it's completely natural to him, we're kind of in like Aquafina's position of what is going, like, did we step into another dimension? What is happening? And then yeah, we get his training sequences and flashbacks after that. So I kind of like the way we established putting him in a situation where he needs to put what he knows to use, and then saying, oh, and by the way, this is how he knows that. And it's like the way to do that to kind of shake up the way the origin story is typically told. Because the origin story told in chronological order is the stuff that we're like really tired of. So it's like these are the same elements of an origin story, but sometimes it actually matters just what order it's in. Like just the way it's put together can make all the difference. Like I said, as something like Batman Begins showed us. But going on talking about stuff like how it's apparently Jackie Chan inspired. I only really got that with one. I mean, there's some moments, like some maneuvers where I can imagine that. But as far as like if one scene stands out as, oh yeah, that reminds me of Jackie Chan, that would be this really big action scene on like scaffolding, I guess it is. And there's it's in every now and then it looks a bit CGI heavy, and some of it may not look completely smooth, but those moments aren't there enough to deter or take away from any of the action itself. Um, and like I said, I'm really surprised by how perfectly timed the comedy is, because there's a whole thing that you would think would be obnoxious and something they'd milk, where Aquafina has chosen a certain song as a defense mechanism. And after that's established, when it shows up here, it's just like perfectly timed to be, and it's kind of the perfect comedy beat in the middle of this really big action scene. And like I said, the fact that they don't milk it, I think, is the big factor here. The thing that we can't ignore, that's probably the problem in a lot of the other comedy that Marvel has tried, is they kind of milk it a little too long. But as far as I know, the comedy here does its job, and then we move on because the action is so busy. Like it doesn't even have time to like try to milk a comedic moment because there's so much going on, and there's so much danger as far as like not just the fighting itself and who the enemy is, but the setting doesn't really give you much time, which is great because the way this scaffolding scene is shot, because obviously there's going to be windows, so it's like sometimes you're not sure if you're looking at a reflection or you're watching in the actual fight, which is really cool. And then every now and then we get like a really far away shot where we see the just how high up they are during this fight, and that works great too. And then this will be about the time that Tony Long comes back into the story. And what's really great about him being here is not only does it give like this sort of really, it's just really surreal in general to see him in like a giant, like a Hollywood movie, because to my understanding this is not something he's ventured into yet, and honestly it's like I'm not asking him to sell out or anything, but there's like so many other movies he could probably add a lot of gravitas to if he tried to continue this. But it's because the thing here is like he's got the Ten Rings, so he's got a lot of power, and a lot of his action scenes are very big. But when he's just kind of like chill, like in his dress shirts, and he's just kind of talking. He's got like serious Bond villain vibes. Like this movie made me want to like. I mean, I'm excited for Rami Malek and everything, but suddenly all I could think about during this movie was what Tony Long would be like as a Bond villain, and I really really want it. um, that and throughout it too, there is talking about the established world that we have. There's some other new characters like his sister, who's very vengeance driven, and their relationship as far as where they're coming from and the death of their mother and the fact that their father is the villain of this story. There's like a whole family dynamic here that really works and kind of brings this sort of emotional ground to it. But we also have returning faces. Some that are consistent characters throughout the movie, some of which are here briefly. One or two faces that we've been waiting quite a while to see how they fit back into it, because we knew they had to come back eventually. I know where one of them is headed, which should be interesting, and this was a nice way to kind of remind people, hey, this character exists, remember? It's been a long ass time since we've seen this character, too long since we've seen this character. So that was fun. And yeah, and then we go forward, and then we meet Michelle Yeoh, and then there's this whole thing where we get even more of the history, but we're still doing. In this particular case, it does feel a bit like we're looking at like, figurines or sculptures or whatever, and then we're getting more story told to us about Michelle Yeoh, and it's like it does have a bit of a museum vibe, but it's still the visuals are cool enough that the more backstory we're getting, the more we're still pulled into it anyway. It never feels like, oh, we're getting another wave of backstory, we're getting another wave of origin story or whatever. It all fits in nicely with the way they kind of interject it in throughout the movie instead of doing it all at once at the beginning, which I really appreciate it for. So, yeah, and then of course there's going to be a big ass climax, and that's the time where I get a little worried whenever I'm watching a Marvel movie. It's like the climaxes can be a bit exhausting and go on for a while and be a bit repetitive. But this one, what's interesting about this one is it doesn't feel repetitive because it has different, it's almost like the climax has different levels, which could feel like very exhausting, potentially, if you're not into the big climaxes. But while I was kind of put off at first when it's like, you kind of think it had reached a certain point and then it's like, oh, there's a brand new threat. And it's like, to be fair, they have been building up this big threat the whole movie. But it's like, it was almost kind of building up like there was a way to almost avoid the threat. Sort of like the whole thing in Civil War where we thought there was going to be some really big, giant climax. But in the end, it was just the Tony versus Steve Zemo thing, and that's all it ended up being. Like, the big plot that you thought it was going to be was just like, oh, no, it's not that at all. I kind of thought we might be getting something like that, where it's like, just avoid the threat instead of fighting the threat. But no, we fight the threat. Because big climax. But by the time they were fighting the threat, it was like, this makes sense. So I'm fine with it having different levels of the threats kind of keep building as it goes until we got our big threat. So yeah, so that happened gradually enough that I was fine with it once it had happened. At first I had this sinking feeling of how much longer is this climax going to be? But once it was happening, it played out well and didn't drag itself out too much. So that worked out. And then we get a couple of lead-ins as far as post-credit scenes go. Because usually the formula seems to have been there's one post-credit scene that tells us where we're going, and then there's another one just for the sake of comedy. And both of these give us something that seems to be sending us in other directions, so that's interesting. So, yeah, so it's like me and my brother were talking about when we did the WandaVision and Loki and Falcon and the Winter Soldier videos, is it's like after Endgame you would think everything was done, and it's like, what else do they have? But nope, here we are again, and I'm just as excited as I've ever been. I really liked Black Widow, like kind of surprisingly. I think I'm not surprised that I liked Black Widow. I'm surprised that I liked Black Widow as much as I did. I think is what the thing is. And then it's building up for something that should be fun. So yeah, so we're going in a bunch of good directions here, and especially with what Loki set up at the end of it with Jonathan Majors. It's yeah, I'm very much back into this, and I'm very excited to see where else we go. And this was a very good addition to the lineup and the new heroes that we're getting as far as the movies go. And it's definitely a character that I'm interested to see where they go. Multiple characters I'm interested to see where we go from here, because they are all very intriguing. So let's go on to Cinderella, which is another musical adaptation of Cinderella. And I was wondering what this was exactly, because Kenneth Branagh's movie from like 5 or 6 years ago doesn't feel like it was 5 or 6 years ago. It feels like it just happened, because there's just been so many Cinderella stories at this point. From, there's the animated one, there's Ever After, there's Ella Enchanted, there's the Hilary Duff one, there's they're just endless. They're everywhere. Um, the Slipper on the Rose was one, right? It's yeah, they're all over the place, and you could do the whole thing of saying we don't need another adaptation of this, but don't even bother. It's a lost cause. They're gonna keep coming. They're relentless. Cinderella is relentless in its adaptations. Um, so okay, as far as this being a musical adaptation, you would think like, oh, I wonder who's playing Cinderella, and I wonder, what kind of songs they've written for it, or something like that. Um, so Cinderella is Camila Cabello. I've heard some people say Cabello, but I think it's Cabello. And I honestly don't care. Um, and the music is not like it's not like a new musical. It's not like songs have been written for this. It's a pre-existing songs thing. It's like a Rock of Ages kind of thing. You could say Rock of Ages, but I couldn't help but notice right away that like two of the first songs were also used in the Happy Feet movies. So as far as like using pre-existing songs, when you're thinking the Happy Feet movies, when you see a Cinderella movie, I don't know. You don't know where we're gonna end up, but yeah. And it's the usual shit. She's got the wicked stepmother who is Idina Menzel in just kind of a lazy bit of casting. It's like we need a wicked stepmother. It's a musical. There you go. And that's not the only thing that feels lazy about the movie, to say the least. Apart from the soundtrack choices. But it's actually, while we're still on the soundtrack, I will just say also, there's kind of a constant disconnect because of that. Because, I mean, I know there's like, auto-tune and stuff like that, but I'm assuming this girl, obviously she's famous for singing. I couldn't tell you a song that she has, or even what her voice sounded like had I not just seen this movie. But there was still like a clear disconnect, like as far as the performance versus the audio. Because obviously the song is playing, and the song is energetic enough. This is throughout, really, just songs in general. But the energy that's in the music doesn't seem to be matching her performance. So it's clear that she's likely not an actress. She should just stick to the singing thing, which is what you can say about a lot of this. But yeah, but to say I'm trying to dance around sounding like mean, so I'm just trying to yeah. But so that's where I'll leave it. There's a disconnect, but there's also the whole thing about the idea of the constant soundtrack, where like obviously this is a musical, so the characters are singing these songs, but it doesn't feel that much different from like the complaints that I have about movies like Cruella or the first Suicide Squad. where the soundtracks are just constant. The songs are just one after the other, and they have no connection to the movie or the story the movie's telling at all. And it's not even the Scorsese thing where he goes less by lyrics and more by sound to be appropriate to the scene. I'm not even getting a sound vibe from these. They're just songs being used. They're just songs you recognize, and they make it sound energetic and modern. But it's just noise that has no meaning whatsoever in those movies. Now imagine if you take the constant soundtracks of like Cruella or the first Suicide Squad. Only it's just the characters are singing it now. It's the same sort of these songs have no connection to this story whatsoever. Like they like maybe vaguely in title, um, but it just feels so empty. And like I said, and it's like they barely even thought about the song choices. They just threw darts at some popular songs, and it's like, okay, this one goes for this scene for whatever reason, and that one to that for whatever reason, and so on. And that's the movie. Like that's the whole movie. And then you would think, oh well, movies like this, maybe at least their production values will bring something. But not, especially in these opening scenes, not really. The sets look really cheap, and it really just looks like modern actors in costume. It kind of looks like, you when you see something like this, sometimes people pull out the criticism. It looks like somebody just putting on a school play. It doesn't just look like you're putting on a school play. This looks like this is a school of teachers who had like dramatic aspirations and didn't get that far, so they're just stuck being teachers. So they're living out their former dreams and putting on a play for themselves that the students are forced to watch. That's what the movie feels like. So, and that's and there was even some point when we see the princess for the first time, and she just kind of walks through the scene, and I wasn't like, my first thought was, is that even a period costume? That just looks like something she would wear at any time. And that's yeah, and obviously there's nothing here as far as character goes. I'm really not into Camila Cabello, just kind of in general. And like I said, she's certainly not an actress, so any any possibility of caring about Cinderella in this adaptation went out pretty quickly. The stepsisters aren't even that mean in this one. They're just kind of bumbling. And even though, I mean, maybe you could say that's like subverting or something, but that's. But then what is there? Because like what's like the driving force? Like what's keeping her here? What's keeping Cinderella in this position of being lower than everybody else? That she's got to come out of, because the movie makes a really big deal out of her coming out of that in some really big triumphant way, but there's just no feeling in it. It's just like, well, because we know the story so well also, it's like there's nothing there anyway. And then like to almost seemingly lower the conflict, like lower what's keeping her here, it's I don't I don't know, but it's more focused on just them singing modern songs is all it really is. Modern compared to the setting of the movie, we'll say. Now, there's really only one thing that kind of drew me to this movie, and honestly, it may be the only thing that made me even watch it to begin with. I may have just skipped this, but last year, while everything was going on, everybody was stuck inside, a friend got me obsessed with Taskmaster. And there is a lot of the British show. There is a lot of people from Taskmaster in this. Rob Beckett is the suitor that Cinderella's going to get stuck with if she doesn't find, Prince Charming or whatever. And Ramesh Ranganathan and James Acaster are the mice, which is interesting, who eventually become human until midnight. The trouble is there's three mice. And the third mouse is James Corden, who is also the producer on this. So we have three mice. We have two very talented comedians, and we have James Corden. Who do you think is going to get most of the focus of the... Like, you would think it'd be the three, it'd be the trio. But one of them is going to get significantly more focus and get more lines and get more comedic beats. Which one do you think it is? So there's that. But also on the Taskmaster front, Doc Brown is in this as well, who has... his part I don't mind, where he's like the town crier, so he just gets a couple of scenes to just like sing about what's happening, and those are fine. Like it felt like it was a distraction from the rest of the movie, so I welcomed those. So thank you, Doc Brown, for trying to distract us from the movie, but the movie kept coming back, unfortunately. So speaking of things that were trying to save this movie, the King and Queen are Pierce Brosnan and Minnie Driver. And Brosnan seems to be having fun with this, and he's relatively fun to watch doing this kind of character. But I don't know that he can bring the movie to watchability. and they try to like do something with Minnie Driver kind of standing up to him, and like how, did they really come from love, or were they just forced together because of royalty, and is that going to happen to their son when he's forced into it instead of going after Cinderella, who he really wants, which you can't really... It's hard to gauge that he really wants Cinderella if you didn't already know the story. I kept forgetting his name. I think it was Robert. But in my head, I just kept calling him Prince Generic Tool. Because that's all he is. Like, he's just a generic tool that's here to look like a tool and sing a little bit and to be attracted to Cinderella for... We're not quite sure what reason, because she climbed a statue and pissed the king off. Maybe it's a rebellion thing. Maybe there actually is no love here, and the whole thing is a facade. Because the whole thing is, oh no, go after who you really love, don't go into some forced relationship. And it's like, it's not only, royalty that's forcing people into relationships. Scripts do that too. And old ancient stories do that too. So, but sure, maybe it's real love. I don't know. There was a bit where there's a couple of scenes where Minnie Driver makes fun of Pierce Brosnan for not having the best singing voice. I couldn't tell, maybe it's both, maybe it's neither. I couldn't tell if maybe that was a vague reference to some of the criticisms Brosnan received for Mamma Mia, even though he's not like, dreadful or anything. That was way played up. But there's also the scene in Goldeneye. And I don't know how many people remember that that's Minnie Driver as the nightclub singer in the Robbie Coltrane scene. And in that, while she's singing in the background, Brosnan makes the joke, who's strangling the cat? And it's like, I would like to think Minnie Driver criticizing Brosnan's singing is a callback to that. I would hope. But I don't know that the movie is that, I don't know if the movie could make a joke that good or a reference that good, is what I'm saying. So, yeah, and most of this, though, is just the singing and the songs and musical numbers that are very, very bland. And songs we already know, telling a story we already know, with no real life and like no real heart, nothing. It feels very much like, hey, these things are popular right now. Camila Cabello, she's popular right now. Billy Porter, he's popular right now. What's really funny about Billy Porter as well is I feel like he's like the face of the movie. Like every time I see like a banner or something, he's like front and center, because he's the fairy godmother now. And he's got the one scene. The fairy godmother shows up, does Billy Porter things, says, "You're screwed at midnight," and leaves. We get bookended narration from him as well, but that's the extent of that. So, so that's what this is. So here's the thing: it might just seem like, oh, it's bland, oh, it's lifeless, oh, there's just nothing to this. There's no reason for this to exist. That can be harder to watch than it sounds. Like, it might be easy to say that, but here's the thing: I wanted this video out a long time ago, because I watched Worth in the morning, because it was already up on Netflix, and then I went to the theater and I saw Shang-Chi, and then the plan was to come back here, watch Cinderella, and then do this video. But it has taken forever for me to get this video out, because I couldn't watch Cinderella all the way through in one sitting. It was one of those things where I had to keep stopping it because it was just mind-numbingly dull, mind-numbingly boring, frustrating, and it's it's just it's so frustratingly nothing that it was driving me crazy. So and my first solution was like, maybe I can skip the songs because there's nothing to those. They don't add anything to the story, as if we don't know what the story is already. And they're not inspired. The numbers aren't inspired. The variations of the singing isn't inspired. It's like if you've heard Camila Cabello sing once, you've heard every song she will do. If you've heard, I know Idina Menzel's like royalty, especially in musicals, but like if you know what her voice sounds like, if you say Idina Menzel in this song, then you know what that song's gonna sound like. You don't even have to hear it. So my first thought was maybe I can skip the songs, but then it's like I just don't do that because I can't. It wouldn't be like I couldn't properly talk about it and bash it if I didn't actually watch it. So I didn't do that. So you just kind of wait out the songs, and then eventually we get to the point where she loses her slipper. But that's the thing, is they're not doing the anonymous thing in this one. Like, he knows what she looks like, and she knows what he looks like from the get-go, because she makes a scene by sitting on Pierce Brosnan's statue. And that's when he falls in love with her, supposedly. Like I said, I think it's just a defiance thing. I don't think there's any love in this movie. But, but whatever, we're supposed to believe that there is. But, so, whatever. But, yeah. So, when he's doing the whole thing of, oh, she left a glass slipper behind, I better find out who it fits. Well, we're not doing the fitting thing, because he's just looking for a face now. So, the glass slipper has nothing to do with this. He's knocking on doors, and if she doesn't answer, he knows it's not her. So I'm not really sure what the focus on the glass slipper was for, except, oh, we're telling Cinderella we gotta do that thing. And once again, I think it thinks it's being, like, subversive about itself and doing these things. Like, there's the whole thing when they make constant jokes about how, oh, glass slippers, that must be so uncomfortable. And shit like that. Like, it's trying to be meta or something. And it's embarrassing. Like, it's just, like, flailing in water while they're drowning is what it looks like. So, yeah. So I was talking about how I have the decency to not skip the songs. But since this movie has no decency, it won't end. So, after this endless montage of him looking for her, with the glass slipper playing no part in this, eventually they find each other, and they announce to the world that love is in the air. This is their love. Like, oh, they're not going to be royalty. She's not going to be princess or queen or anything like that. She's simply his love. Which, as I said, there's an absence of love in this movie entirely. But here's the thing also, is now that this is announced, what is the only thing left to do in a movie like this? A movie this desperate to exist, that's going to do anything it can to stay alive. What is it? Is it sharks that do that thing where if they stop moving they die? I guess that's what the movie was afraid of. So, they're going to dance. I felt like I was watching the end of Norm of the North again, because this dancing went on for an eternity. And you know the thing that usually movies are merciful, and they'll like put the end credits up while the dancing is happening? No, this movie has no mercy. We have to watch all the dancing. So they dance, and they dance, and they dance, and they dance, and they dance. And they dance, and they keep dancing, and they keep dancing, and they keep dancing. There's still no credits in sight. We have to watch the whole thing as they just keep dancing forever and ever and ever. And then finally we get one more piece of narration, and it's Billy Porter saying, her name is Ella, not Cinderella, get it right. Because we're subversive. Because we're updated. Or some bullshit. I don't know. But then it finally ends. I thought after a while I was hallucinating the end credits because I thought there was no. It was like a mirage in the desert. It's like I've been too corrupted by the dancing. I'm convinced the movie doesn't have an end. I'm sure this is my mind. This is my mind being hopeful. Like this is my mind lying to me. These aren't actual end credits. The movie's not actually over, right? And it was. I think it was. I shut it off, so so if it so it was gonna end either way. So yeah, that was pure and complete torture. And once again, not really in the, like it wasn't me saying like, oh my god, this is so bad, this is so bad. Which is I think what a lot of people were saying before it even happened, which is unfair even to shitty movies. Like at least like if you really are that desperate to bash a movie, you gotta watch the fucking thing. And it'll give you even more ammunition. So do it if you want to do that. But no, it's just so excruciatingly nothing. It's so fucking soulless, and it's like the worst parts of movies that aren't that bad but have terrible aspects to them. It's like take those terrible aspects and make it an entire movie and amplify it, and try really really hard to be super super lovable, and it's so. That's what that is, and I'm glad that's out of my life forever. So let's go back to the good stuff. Let's go to Worth, which is a movie that just went up on Netflix. And I remember hearing about it at like last year's Sundance, I think. I saw like the one still of Michael Keaton and Stanley Tucci at the Opera House. It was like the only thing I knew about it for a long time, and that it was 9/11 related. I wasn't quite sure what the story was exactly. The story is about the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund, which is one of those stories where it's like, especially when people like cash in on tragedies so quickly, when you hear that a movie has been made about this aspect of that, it's one of those cases where you're surprised that it hadn't happened yet. But now that we're in retrospect and we are coming up on 20 years out from that tragedy, I'd say it's as good a time as any. And I was wondering if it was going to be, because there are movies like this that can be really effective, and there's other movies like this that are just like, you're better off with a documentary because they're just basically listing off statistics and stuff like that, and it can be quite dull despite the subject matter being something really crucial and emotionally involving and all that stuff. But obviously, subject matter doesn't always make a good movie on principle. You still gotta write the movie and make the movie and all that. And this brings that. So when we start off, we're right on the cusp of it. There's a really eerie scene when we're getting just kind of introduced to the characters at the beginning, and this is the morning of 9/11, and there's this really eerie moment where we're just watching the characters be the characters, and then like a plane flies over, and it's like really low, and it just goes in the frame and then out of the frame, and then a little bit later is when everything starts to happen, and we see just the way they portray the building of it, and where like people aren't quite sure what's happening. Like it's really hard to portray the morning of 9/11 in a movie and not have it be effective. Because of the way there was just like the confusion and all that, and you can see it like gradually building up as people started to panic. And they set up this thing early where Keaton's like listening to music with like his noise canceling headphones, so his like when his wife says goodnight, he doesn't hear anything. And then he's like on the subway or on the train in the morning, just going to work like he usually does. And while Keaton's just listening to his music, completely oblivious, you see all the chaos as the news is breaking out and people are like seeing out the window what's happening, and it's really effectively done. It kind of sets up Keaton's almost out of place factor here, coming into this as he and Amy Ryan come in as the lawyers, and they talk about how all these victims are going to need compensation, and then we get these really towering questions about how all the different kinds of people on all the different levels that were in those buildings, where it's like you've got the really really higher ups and like the CEOs and the super super rich people, and you also had janitors in there, and it's like the idea of balancing out compensation, and it's like, are you, as far as like where money goes and how much, and it's like if you give more to the rich people, is that going to be like the idea of just being human beings at one level, and like the placement of where you are in your occupation or wherever, and just your worth in general, like actually having to put a monetary number on a person's life, and it's like, do you do you even do that, and if so, how do you do that? And it's like just how completely inhumane it is to say that one person is worth another because of their place in life. um, and I think it could have gone more into that. Like it brings that up a lot, but I think it could have been a little explored more. Um, but yeah, and then especially when we bring in the Stanley Tucci character, who is somebody who lost his wife, but who is very sort of calm and wise in a very Stanley Tucci way. I could see some criticism. This character might be a bit moviefied, like maybe he's a little too idealistic in just how in control he is. But he comes in with the whole thing where it's like it's clear that not only is this whole plan of we've got to assign a money value to people's lives, um, but the whole shady aspect of the main jumping off point for this whole thing was we don't want to get sued. We don't want the airlines to get sued. So it's like it's so many of these inhumane places this is coming from, while the people in charge of it, like Keaton and Amy Ryan, are trying to be as humane as possible, but also Keaton in particular is kind of trying to, have the middle ground where it's like he wants to hear the stories and he wants to listen, but he's also trying to be like, I need to do this from an objective standpoint, to be able to do this right, and naturally that's not the way it plays out the first time he's in front of a crowd, and it's like it's not that easy to just say, I'm gonna be able to look these people in the face that have lost so much of their lives and just say, this is the way it is. And it's like, he learns very, very quickly it's not gonna be that easy. um, and it reminded me a lot of Up in the Air. The scenes where Clooney and Anna Kendrick have to be face to face with the people and fire them, basically, and tell them, like, they're no matter how long you've been doing this, you are just cut off from your money now. Like, good luck taking care of your family and all the other things you need to do to stay alive. It feels a lot like that, because there's a lot of these scenes where it's like kind of an interview style where they're talking to the individual family members of the victims, and those are the scenes that are really heavy, and I think that they put so much focus on that as a real strength. I don't think there's any, because with Up in the Air, to my understanding, most of the people that weren't recognizable faces, like J.K. Simmons or Zach Galifianakis, were actually people that had been through that, real people that had been through that. I don't know or think that these are like real people or real families of victims or anything like that, but especially since there's one in particular that gets a bit more of a storyline that kind of goes off on its own thing that presents a whole bunch of other problems that Keaton has to deal with, which feels very movie-like, but it gives it kind of a strong narrative to kind of get from point A to point B, and to keep it from getting a bit too. It could have been more directionless than it was, I think, if it didn't have some kind of through line, given the way they were telling the story. So I can see why stuff like that would be here. And plus, you have what Tucci's got going on, where he's the one that basically stands up and says, I'm being civil with you, and I'm being calm, and I'm trying to not be overly emotional, but your plan sucks, and I can fix it, and I'm gonna fix it. So, yeah. And then the relationship between them is something where it's like you can kind of feel it, like, sort of speeding through things a little bit. Some things, like his relationship with Tucci, or the way Keaton eventually wins over a lot of these people, because it is of course, they do a nice balance that you would think would be difficult to do and probably was difficult to do. Um, where when you do like these interview scenes, obviously it's really showing the victims' families and where they are, who obviously are victims themselves, really, and just the horrible place that they're in. And then that's when you realize it's like it would be easy to emotionally distance yourself from Keaton's character because you can sense where these people are coming from and how not only is nothing going to really make this right, even if it's a lot of money, but just the whole idea of everybody knows the almost kind of shady place it's coming from, where it's like, we're basically just doing this to shut you up, more or less. So you have these thousands of people that are extremely resentful because they can see through this. Um, but they obviously they're still going to need that compensation because a lot of these people that died were the providers and the families, um, and so many children were left behind. And while a lot of that is the focus, it does also kind of do simultaneously this thing of like, you see the families and what they're going through, and then it'll just cut to Keaton in a room by himself. And while it would be easy to be emotionally distant from Keaton's character, it is, you can feel the weight of how seemingly impossible the task is of distributing all this evenly to these thousands and thousands of people that loathe the sight of you. When he is genuinely trying to help, he does it without a fee and all that. But it's, you just feel the heaviness coming from everybody throughout it. So because I could see it not sitting well if a lot of the focus was, oh, this is so bad for Keaton's character, and that's all it really focused on. There's definitely a balance of seeing it from a lot of because the movie kind of has the same issue, the same conflict that Keaton's character does, where it's like you can only show so many grieving characters that it might seem like they're not getting into that enough. But the movie can only do so much in 2 hours. Like, it would have to be like a whole mini series, a or not even a mini series, a full on multiple season series. If you wanted to get the vibe of more of these people and their grief and where they're coming from. But like the fact that we just get a few ones that kind of get a focus, and you can still feel the weight of them having to put this on. Amy Ryan especially, kind of, we can almost kind of see her on the verge of collapse from the weight of it. And yeah, it's strong throughout. I was wondering if obviously it's not only just because Keaton and Tucci are in it, but just in general, there's a lot of Spotlight vibes. Like, it's like the structure is very, very Spotlight just in itself. And I was wondering throughout the movies if Worth might be making a bigger splash in general if Spotlight didn't exist. And if the fact that it seems to have so much in common with Spotlight and, to a degree, Up in the Air, that it'll feel like sort of territory we've already been in, despite being a portion of this real life event we haven't looked into yet as far as movies go. Um, but I mean, it feels a lot like, whether it be the interviews, or there's even a scene where Keaton has to go to somebody's house to have a conversation he doesn't want to have at Christmas, like with the Christmas decorations and everything. It's like, that's a scene right out of Spotlight. And then of course the ending eventually when he goes to the office and it's all, everybody's calling in and there's all the walk-ins and all that stuff, and it's like, it's, the structure is literally Spotlight. um, so I'm wondering if that's gonna downplay it's the punch that it has. But I don't know. I may like this about as much as I like Spotlight, because I wasn't like totally completely in love with Spotlight. But it's, and it was also a movie that had to kind of grow on me and kind of really take everything in over multiple viewings. So that had a lot to do with that. But this one I felt, so maybe, Spotlight was like a training ground for this or something, because like I felt invested in this pretty quickly. But yeah, so going in, I kind of thought that it would be kind of generic, which is where movies like this can typically fall into, unless you're like of a spotlight quality or something like that. Yeah, and like I was saying, a lot of movies like this might just kind of coast on their subject matter, and it's like, because we're telling this story, we're automatically an important movie. We don't have to do anything else. But no, we've got the way they tell the story and the way they spotlight the victims and their families, and then balance that out with what Keaton and Amy Ryan and stuff are going through. I do think there's definitely something here we're checking out. So that's, I think, where I'm going to leave that. So I guess we're done with this. Until next week, where we have Malignant, the new James Wan movie, and a couple of other things that I don't remember. And we're going to keep going. We've got like versus stuff, and I'm going to talk about some, series of movies, some trilogies, and then we'll get through September, and then October we get a lot of our horror stuff. So we'll see how that goes. But until then, I think that's it.